The easiest way to ignore a black engineer is to nod while he's speaking and assume the real decision will still be made by somebody else. Jordan Ellison had seen that look for most of his career. It was never loud at first, never obvious enough for a training seminar. It showed up in conference rooms when he finished explaining a risk model and someone turned to a white colleague to ask if they agreed. It showed up on site visits when contractors assumed he was there for compliance paperwork instead of structural authority. It showed up in the polite pauses after he said, "This needs to be shut down," when men with less experience and more comfort in the room decided what he really meant was, "Please consider it." Jordan was 38, one of the lead structural engineers for the Howlbrook Transit Authority, and the kind of man who built his reputation on precision. He did not dramatize. He did not guess. He did not mistake instinct for evidence. If he put a warning in writing, it was because he had checked the numbers twice, the load history 3 times, and the material behavior until there was no daylight left between concern and fact. That was why the meeting on Tuesday morning made his jaw tighten. The Redwood Crossing Bridge carried 6 lanes of traffic over the Marston River and linked 2 of the busiest commercial districts in the county. More than 80,000 vehicles used it every day. It was not old enough to be famous, not new enough to be trusted blindly, and not well-maintained enough for Jordan's comfort. Months of freeze-thaw cycles, a backlog in repairs, and 2 years of deferred reinforcement work had left the bridge sitting in that dangerous category infrastructure people hate most, still functioning, still open, still taken for granted, and already speaking in small warnings no one wanted to hear because closure would be expensive. Jordan had spent the last 3 weeks reviewing vibration anomalies and sensor drift coming from the bridge's central monitoring system. At first glance, the issue looked minor. A few irregular load transfer readings in the east suspension assembly, some strain spikes in the secondary support brackets along the midspan deck. Nothing dramatic on its own, but structures rarely fail by announcing themselves all at once. They whisper first, a fraction of movement, a behavior change in stress response, a repeated pattern at just the wrong interval. Jordan listened to whispers for a living. He stood at the end of the conference table in the Transit Authority's operations room, while a slide showing the bridge's sensor history glowed behind him. "We need an immediate partial closure," he said. "At minimum, shut the 2 outer eastbound lanes and restrict freight loads until we inspect the lower support assembly and replace the compromised bracket anchors." Around the table sat 8 people. Project managers, operations staff, budget oversight, maintenance leads. And at the head of the table, Deputy Infrastructure Director Thomas Weller. Weller was white, late 50s, silver-haired, expensive glasses, the kind of administrator who had spent so long near technical work that he had begun to confuse proximity with competence. He liked sounding decisive. He liked reminding people that public systems required balancing safety with practicality. And he especially liked doing that balancing when the safety concerns belonged to someone else. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Jordan," he said in the patient tone men use when they are about to reduce expertise to temperament, "your memo describes a potential condition, not an active failure." Jordan clicked to the next slide. Heat maps, load clusters, comparative readings from the previous quarter. "It describes accelerating instability in a known weak zone," he said. "The bracket displacement is increasing under asymmetric load, and the sensor cluster on the east support line triggered 3 independent caution events last week." A white maintenance supervisor named Glenn Pritchard gave a small, dismissive hum. "Caution events aren't alarms." Jordan turned toward him. "They become alarms when people keep treating them like suggestions." A couple of people looked down at their notes. Weller's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. He did not like being contradicted in a room where hierarchy was supposed to cushion him from that feeling. "We've seen noisy readings before," he said. "Last winter you flagged the West Deck oscillation, and it turned out to be calibration drift." Jordan did not blink, and I corrected that in the same report, which is why I know this isn't drift. Glenn smiled the way some men do when they think a black professional has become just a little too direct. "You always come in hot on these things." There it was. Not wrong, not technical, just personal. Jordan looked at him. "No, I come in early." That landed harder than Glenn expected. At the far side of the table, A young data analyst named Priya Nair quietly pushed her tablet forward. For what it's worth, she said, the bridge telemetry does support a trend change. I reran the strain model this morning. Weller barely glanced at her. And does your model predict imminent failure? Priya hesitated. Not imminent failure specifically, but increased probability of abrupt support distress under heavy dynamic load. Weller gave a short exhale and looked back at Jordan, ignoring the substance in favor of the opening he wanted. Increased probability is not a legal basis to shut down 2 lanes of a major commuter bridge at rush hour. Jordan had expected this. That was the worst part. He had walked into the room already knowing he would need more certainty than anyone else to get the same deference. If a white senior engineer with his record had made this recommendation, they might still have pushed back on cost, but they would not have leaned so easily on the idea that he was overreacting. He clicked to the last image, a close-up of the east lower support assembly from the previous afternoon's inspection drone, hairline cracking at one anchor plate, barely visible unless you knew exactly what the pattern meant. This, Jordan said, is a fatigue propagation line. Glenn squinted. That could be surface corrosion. No, Jordan said. It could not. Weller leaned forward now, studying the image with exaggerated seriousness. You're saying a visible crack of uncertain depth justifies public closure. I'm saying the crack, the displacement trend, the asymmetric strain behavior, and the sensor anomalies describe the same story. Weller tapped a pen on the table. Or they describe a maintenance priority. Jordan felt the familiar cold irritation settle into place. That was how these moments worked. A black expert brings evidence. A white superior reframes urgency as perspective. Then, if consequences come, everyone later says the warning was heard, just not conclusive. He closed his laptop halfway. If you won't authorize closure, he said, then I want it recorded that I recommended one in writing and advised against sustained heavy load traffic over the eastbound span until full inspection. The room changed slightly, because written record is where institutional doubt becomes liability. Weller noticed it too. No one is stopping you from documenting your professional opinion. My professional opinion, Jordan said evenly, is that the bridge is one bad load cycle away from forcing this decision for us. Glenn let out a short laugh. That's dramatic. Jordan looked at him. No, he said, it's engineering. The meeting ended the way bad meetings do, with soft language covering a hard refusal. Enhanced monitoring, no closure. Reassess after 48 hours. Someone from communications would prepare contingency messaging if needed. Weller signed off on expedited field review for the following morning, which in practical terms meant waiting. Waiting while traffic kept pounding the structure. Waiting while the bridge kept talking. Jordan left the room with Priya walking beside him. I backed you as much as I could, she said quietly. I know. She glanced at him. You think it's that close? Jordan did not answer immediately. Outside, through the operations center windows, he could see the far outline of Redwood Crossing in the distance, steel and concrete catching the gray afternoon light like something permanent. That bridge doesn't like what it's carrying anymore, he said. Priya was silent for a moment. You think Weller heard you? Jordan gave a humorless half-smile. He heard me. That's not the same as believing me. At 5:17 p.m., rush hour built exactly the way engineers dread and city planners pretend is normal. Traffic thickened across Redwood Crossing in dense parallel bands. Delivery trucks, commuter sedans, buses, utility vans. Brake lights rippling in red chains over the eastbound lanes. The bridge's sensor network streamed live data to the Transit Authority Operations Center downtown, where Jordan stood behind Priya's station with his arms folded and his attention fixed on the east support panel. The readings were wrong, not catastrophic yet, just wrong in a way he hated. Strain spikes were climbing too fast under moderate load. The displacement on bracket line E4 had jumped twice in 12 minutes. The frequency response in the lower support assembly had shifted, as if the structure was no longer distributing force the way it had even that morning. Priya looked up at him. E4 is oscillating. I see it. Could it still be sensor error? Jordan didn't answer, because at that moment the bridge answered for him. A red warning box flashed across the telemetry screen. Support distress event. East lower assembly. Then another. Load transfer exceeds safe tolerance. The room froze. 3 desks away, a systems operator actually stood up. Priya whispered, "Oh no." Then the audible alarm triggered. Sharp, repetitive, unmistakable. Every head in operations turned at once. Weller, who had been in his office reviewing a budget brief, came out fast, face already irritated at the interruption, until he saw the screen. Jordan was already moving. "Shut it down," he said. No one argued now, not because they had become wiser, because the bridge had spoken in a language they were finally willing to trust. Jordan leaned over the operations console. "Trigger immediate lane closure. Full eastbound stop. Dispatch highway patrol and bridge response now." The operator's hands shook as she keyed commands. Digital warning signs lit on the traffic network. Barrier arms engaged at the east approach. Emergency messaging went out to police, transit, and road crews simultaneously. On the live structural feed, the support readings surged again. Then came the image from the bridge camera. Not a collapse. Worse in some ways because it was so close. A visible lurch across the east outer span. A metal shutter running through the support frame. Concrete dust kicking from beneath the lower deck seam. One of the eastbound outer lanes dipped by several inches and held. Held. If traffic had remained fully open for even a few more load cycles, one more packed truck cluster, one more chain of breaking freight, one more badly timed surge, the support assembly might have torn deeper and taken part of the lane with it. The operations room was silent except for the alarm and radio chatter. Jordan stared at the screen, heart pounding, not with triumph, but with the sick familiarity of being right too close to disaster. Weller stepped beside him at last. His face had gone pale under the fluorescent lights. "How many vehicles were on the outer lane when it triggered?" he asked. Priya was already pulling the frame analysis. 6 passenger vehicles, 1 commercial van. Closure sequence stopped additional load from entering. Jordan did the math in his head automatically. Too close. Too close. Too close. Within minutes, helicopters were circling, police were redirecting traffic, and local news stations were pushing alerts about an emergency structural incident on Redwood Crossing. The eastbound side of the bridge remained standing, but the visuals were enough to terrify anyone watching. Emergency vehicles, halted traffic, flashing signs, engineers in hard hats converging under evening sirens. And in the center of it all, the exact support zone Jordan had flagged in writing had triggered the alarm. Exactly where he warned. Exactly when he said the risk window was narrowing. An hour later, under floodlights and a hard river wind, Jordan stood on the maintenance access platform beneath the bridge with a field inspection team. The anchor plate had partially sheared. 2 bracket bolts had warped under redistributed load. The fatigue crack had spread deeper through the assembly than even Jordan's worst interpretation from the drone image had shown. Glenn Pritchard climbed down the access ladder behind him, looked once at the damage, and said nothing. For the first time all week, silence suited him. Jordan crouched near the support plate, flashlight steady in one gloved hand, and traced the fracture line with his eyes. If the alarm had triggered 15 minutes later, full freight density would have been on the span. If closure had waited until morning, the bridge might have failed under ordinary traffic. Not total catastrophic collapse maybe, but enough lane loss, enough structural drop, enough chain reaction wreckage to kill people who had simply been driving home. A white field inspector named Rebecca Sloan exhaled sharply beside him. "You called this almost exactly." Jordan kept looking at the metal. "Not almost." That night, the governor's office called, then the mayor, then transportation oversight. By midnight, Redwood Crossing was national news. A major urban bridge had suffered a near-failure event during rush hour and escaped disaster by minutes. Reporters wanted causes, accountability, and names. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the internal emergency briefing had become a public reckoning. Jordan sat at the far end of the executive conference room while the authority's senior leadership reviewed the timeline on a projection screen. Meeting notes, sensor logs, inspection images, his written recommendation for immediate lane closure, Weller's authorization for delay, then the alarm event, the closure order, and the structural distress footage. The room felt colder than usual. The Transit Authority Commissioner, a woman named Elena Ruiz with no patience for self-protective vagueness, looked directly at Weller. Did Mr. Ellison recommend partial closure before the alarm? Weller shifted. He expressed a strong concern based on preliminary indicators. Jordan did not move. Commissioner Ruiz looked at the printed memo in front of her. That is not what I asked. A pause. Then Weller said, yes. Ruiz tapped the memo. He recommended lane restriction, freight limitation, and immediate inspection. Another pause. Yes. She looked toward Jordan. Mr. Ellison, in your professional view, would implementing your recommendation yesterday morning have prevented the emergency trigger? Jordan answered without drama. Yes. Ruiz nodded once and turned back to the room. Then let us stop using soft language to protect hard failures. No one spoke after that. By afternoon, Weller had been placed under formal review. Glenn Pritchard was reassigned. An external audit was announced. News outlets got hold of the internal timeline by evening. And while the official statements remained polished, the story beneath them was simple enough for anyone to understand. A black engineer warned them. They doubted him. The bridge alarm proved he was right. The interviews began the next day. Jordan hated interviews. He agreed to one anyway because he understood how institutions work. If he stayed silent, they would turn his judgment into a generic system success story. The sensors worked, the protocols activated. The response was swift. They would smooth over the more human part, that a man had seen the danger in time, put it in writing, and still had to wait for a machine to scream before people took him seriously. So he stood in a hard hat by the closed bridge perimeter while microphones lifted toward him and cameras searched his face for narrative. A reporter asked, "Did you feel vindicated when the alarm went off?" Jordan looked at her for a moment. "Vindicated," he said. "No, I felt relieved no one died." Another asked, "Do you think your warning was dismissed?" Jordan chose his words carefully because truth sounds different when spoken on record. "I think in technical environments, people like to believe decisions are purely objective," he said. "But objectivity is only as good as the people interpreting the information. If the same evidence gets taken more seriously depending on who presents it, that's not an engineering problem. That's a culture problem." That clip spread farthest, not because it was loud, because it was exact. In the weeks that followed, Redwood Crossing remained partially shut for emergency reinforcement. Jordan led the redesign review team, not because the authority suddenly became enlightened, but because after near disaster, credentials become harder to ignore when they are already sitting in your own building. Priya stopped by his office one evening with updated stabilization models and a tired smile. "You know they're all quoting you now," she said. Jordan looked up from the plans. "That's not as flattering as people think." She leaned against the doorframe. "Still, they heard it." He set the pen down. "After the alarm." She nodded once. "After the alarm." That was the point, really. And the cost of it stayed with him more than the praise did. Being right had saved lives, but being doubted first had nearly cost them. People loved stories about recognition after the fact. They loved redemption arcs in press releases. They loved praising black expertise once it had survived public trial by consequence. What they loved less was the deeper correction. Trust it sooner. Hear it sooner. Act before the alarm. A month later, at the formal infrastructure hearing, Jordan gave technical testimony before the City Oversight Board. Charts, load paths, material fatigue, system response, closure timing, all the language that mattered. But at the end, one council member asked him a question no one in the room could hide from. "What is the main lesson from Redwood Crossing?" Jordan looked at the board, then at the audience behind them, full of agency staff, reporters, contractors, and public officials. "The lesson," he said, "is that bridges do not fail because gravity is biased. They fail because people decide which warnings sound credible before the evidence has finished speaking." No one interrupted him. And when the person warning you has to clear an extra threshold just to be believed, that delay becomes part of the risk. The hearing room stayed quiet long after he finished. Later that evening, as he stood alone near the fenced-off pedestrian overlook above the river, Jordan watched work lights glow across the wounded bridge. Steel crews moved in bright vests. Weld flashes sparked against the dark. The structure was being held, corrected, strengthened. the city would eventually trust Redwood Crossing again. People always do. They drive over repaired things and forget how close they came to breaking. But Jordan knew some of the younger engineers would remember. The black engineer they doubted did not raise his voice, did not grandstand, did not wait for permission to be precise. He wrote the report. He said the bridge was talking, and when the sensors finally screamed where he had already pointed, the whole system had to admit that expertise had been standing in the room all along. If you want, I can also turn this into a stronger YouTube-style version with a more dramatic opening and ending hook.